Hey, welcome back, and I hope you guys are doing pretty good. I hope you guys had a good weekend. Remember, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. I know it's an online class, and I know it's asynchronous, and I know it's quite difficult for you to sort of keep up with the work always, because you just need extra motivation to do so. But if you have questions or you don't understand something, please don't hesitate to ask. Um, Questions, just send me an email, come to my office, just send me an email for an appointment via Zoom. Okay. Today we're gonna be looking at chapter 5, and so far we've explored chapter 3, we've explored chapter 4, and chapter 4 basically was looking at how to measure the performance of the economy, right? So we said GDP is basically what economists use in trying to see how well the economy is performing. So how do we know we're in economic expansion? How do we know the economy is basically growing, right? It's basically using GDP. Um, and I said there are three major indicators of how well an economy is doing, and economists always pay attention to those indicators, right? The first is obviously GDP, and you know how to calculate GDP right now. Okay, so you guys are pros and you guys are masters at calculating GDP, which is really wonderful. Okay, the second one we'll be looking at in chapter 5 is unemployment, and the third one is basically inflation. Okay, so we're looking at inflation and unemployment in chapter 5, right? And for the last few months, the job market has been quite rough. Some of your colleagues had internships cancelled, job offers rescinded, or probably even no job offers at all. And you probably know people who actually lost their jobs due to the recession we currently are in. Unemployment rate in the United States is pretty bad right now. If you look at the current unemployment rate in the United States, right, as of April this year, unemployment rates went pretty high. It was at really scary levels, not trying to scare anyone. But it was at pretty high levels, right? Unemployment rate. I mean, just take a look at this graph. Okay, so we're looking at historical unemployment rates in the United States from 1950 to 2020. And we've never seen unemployment rate this high before. Okay, so this is absolutely unprecedented. This is absolutely mind-boggling. Okay, and this happened during April. I think unemployment rate was around 14.8%, 14.7%. Unprecedented in over 60 years. That is unbelievable, right? And current unemployment rate is I think around 8.5%, 8%. Which is pretty close to financial recession levels. And we know the financial recession was pretty bad. Okay, so things are pretty bad. But I think the good thing is that the recovery or the sharp turn shows that the recovery has been quick. Generally, when an unemployment rate rises, it takes a while to actually recover. It rises for a while, keeps on rising, and then it takes a while for it to recover. But this one has been pretty sharp and quick, so that is good, right? But it's still unprecedented. This is the national unemployment rate in the United States, okay? But what about the state unemployment rate? Okay, so let's look at the unemployment rate in Iowa, and it's basically the same, right? Again, it's way above the recession levels. And we know the recession was pretty bad, okay? But unemployment rate was way above the recession levels and is now coming towards the recession levels of the financial recession levels of 2008, okay? So even in Iowa, we still see it as bad, So maybe you know someone who lost a job, or maybe you lost your own job of it. And I know this is sort of like a sensitive issue when you're talking about unemployment rate generally, but it's something we need to look at, okay? In April, in Iowa, it was around 11%. And now in July is around 6.6%. Okay, so it's things are getting better, and I think that's what we need to take a look at. Okay, but we can actually do better than that. You can actually calculate unemployment rate in Bremer County, which is basically home of Waverly, right? And even in Bremer County, people got affected. Unemployment rate was relatively high, around maybe 8.5%, and now it's coming back to maybe sort of, at least it's better than the recession levels, the highest point of the recession levels, okay? So after studying this chapter, okay, you should be able to sort of measure the unemployment rate. And I say sort of because unemployment rate is a bit complicated to measure, but we'll look at it in a simple term, okay? So you should be able to measure the unemployment rate and other labor market indicators, okay? You should be able to explain why unemployment occurs and what is present even at full employment, okay? So we have what we call full employment, and you probably take a look at it. And then finally, we'll look at inflation rate. Okay, so that'll be down later. We'll look at inflation rate, why inflation is a problem, and how we actually measure the inflation rate. Okay, right. So these are the three major things we'll be looking at in this chapter, and I'm pretty excited. Okay, but the first thing we need to talk about is why should anyone care about the unemployment rate? Okay, why is unemployment such a huge problem? Why are politicians always harping about the unemployment rate? And I think that is something we need to focus on, and I think that's something we sort of need to understand before we actually even look at a measurement of the unemployment rate. Okay, so just take a moment to think about it. Why unemployment is such a huge problem? Okay, well, if there's unemployment, we have loss of production, and we can't enjoy goods and services like we did before. Okay, so our standard of living drops. And we know that production is basically tied into income. Okay, so if production decreases, logically, income also decreases. And if income decreases, well, we can't spend as much income as before, so there's a loss of consumption. And if there's loss of consumption, our living standards basically drop. Okay, so we actually worse off. Also, if you think about it, unemployment leads to a loss of human capital, right? Valuable human capital that could have been used in valuable areas of the sectors are basically lost due to unemployment. And it's not even just about monetary or economic gain or economic sort of effects, but you can also look at psychological effects, right? Unemployment leads to a loss of self-esteem, basically. And you don't feel good about yourself. You don't, especially if you're supposed to be the breadwinner of your family, you're supposed to support your family or a household. You don't really feel good about the fact that you are actually unemployed. Okay, so unemployment is a huge problem that needs to be tackled. That no wonder politicians and economists always harp about the unemployment rate, and they basically talk about the unemployment rate as sort of this barometer or this yardstick for success if the unemployment rate is relatively low. Okay, so the next thing we do is basically sort of see how the unemployment rate in the United States particularly is basically measured or is basically calculated. Okay, so there's something called the CPS, which is the Current Population Survey. And every month, the US Census Bureau, right, who are basically in charge, well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but they're also basically in charge of helping with the unemployment rate, surveys 60,000 households and ask questions about the age and job market status of each household. And this is basically the Current Population Survey, right? So they call 60,000 households, they send emails or they call them, and they ask questions about the age of people in the household, the job market status of each household. Do you have a job? Do you not have a job? Are people in different institutions? Are some people in the military, right? And this is done every month, okay? And the working age population. So the population is basically divided into two groups, okay? So we have the working age population. So the working age population is the number of people who are basically 16 years and older, okay? Not in jail, not in some institution, not in hospital or some other institutional care, or also not in the military. Okay, so that is the working age population. Okay, the number of people aged 16 years and older who are not in jail, hospital, or some other institution. Okay, and that is what we really care about, the working age population. Okay, and then they also divide it up into the other segments, which is people who are too young to work. So under 16 years of age, all people are basically in some sort of institutional care, right? So we have the working age population. So you survey these people, 60,000 people, you group them into the working age population. Number of people are 16 years and older who are able to work, okay? And the people who aren't able to work, essentially, okay? And then furthermore, the working age population is divided into two groups. We have people who are actually in the labor force, okay? And people who are not in the labor force, okay? So we have people who are supposed to be willing and able to work. So basically they are in the labor force and they're looking for jobs or whatnot, okay? Or maybe they have jobs already. And we have people who are not in the labor force, meaning maybe they've given up on their job or maybe they've retired or whatever, right? So that's the working age population divided into these two groups, okay? And this is the first sort of information or formula you need to know. The labor force is the sum of employed and unemployed workers. Okay, so labor force equals employed plus unemployed. Okay, E plus U for short. Okay, so the labor force is basically made up of all the people who actually are working, right, and are able to work, and also all the people who actually are able to work, but they don't have a job, right, and they're actively looking for a job. Okay, so to be employed is relatively easy. You know that to be employed, you have a job. But what does it really mean to be unemployed according to the US Bureau, US Census Bureau? Okay, what does it really mean to be unemployed? Okay, so to be counted as unemployed, you must actually sort of have one of the following three categories. Okay, you should basically be without work, but you've made specific efforts to find a job within the previous 4 weeks. Okay, so you don't have a job, but within the last 4 weeks, you've made some effort, right? Significant effort at least, to actually find a job. Okay, or you should be waiting to be called back to a job, right, from which you've been laid off. Okay, or the third requirement is you should be waiting to start a new job within 30 days. Okay, so if you have any of these categories, or if you fit into any of these three categories, right, you're basically part of those they count as unemployed. Okay, you're basically part of those they count as unemployed. Okay, all right, so let's look at how the labor force or the labor market in the United States basically looks like. Okay, looks like. Right, so in July 2020, the entire population of the United States was 330 million. Okay, as of July 2020, the working age population was 260 million. Okay, so out of that 330 million, 260 million belong to the working age population, and the rest were basically young and institutionalized. Okay, out of the working age population, the labor force basically made up 160 million. Okay, and those not in the labor force basically will make up roughly 100 million, right? Because you have the working age population being those in the labor force and those not in the labor force. Out of the labor force, you actually had those who were basically employed, which was 142 million, and those unemployed being 80 million. So remember, the labor force equals the employed plus the unemployed. Okay, so that basically gives you 160 million, right? And this figures is pretty current as of July 2020. Okay, so this is sort of like a snapshot of what the US Census Bureau basically does. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, basically that's what they look at. Okay, so they actually divvy up things into these different groups and these different segments, and from there they actually look at three job market indicators, or what we economists like to call three labor market indicators. And the first one is the unemployment rate. Okay, so these are really important stuff. Okay, we have what we call the employment to population ratio. And then finally, we have what we call the labor force participation rate. Okay, so we actually explain these in more detail. Okay, but these are the three labor market indicators. We look at these indicators to see how the job market is doing. So, for example, if the unemployment rate is really high, it means that the job market is really bad. Okay, if the employment to population ratio is really high, it means that the job market generally is good. And if the labor force participation rate is high, it means that the job market generally is good. So you want these to be high, these two to be high, okay? But then you want this to be relatively low, okay? So we see how we actually calculate these three job market or labor market indicators, right? So the first is the unemployment rate, okay? So the unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed, okay? So you find the percentage. Remember, the labor force is made up of employed plus unemployed. So to actually find the unemployment rate, which percentage of the people in the labor force, those people are actually able to work, are basically unemployed. Okay, so the unemployment rate is calculated as the number of people unemployed, all divided by the labor force times 100. Okay, so that is how we find the unemployment rate in the United States and basically everywhere else, right? This is how the unemployment rate is basically calculated. It's an international sort of formula, it's an international standard, okay? It's the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. So in July 2020, the labor force was 160 million and 80 million were unemployed. So the unemployment rate was basically 11%. Okay. So how did we get that? It was 18 divided by 160, right? All times 100. Okay. And we should get 11%. Okay. You should get 11%, right? That's simple. Right, so basically that's what economists do, right? So that's how we calculate the unemployment rate. It's relatively that simple. Okay, so this unemployment rate you basically see in, right, and unemployment rate increases generally when a country tends to be in a recession. Okay, so currently we're sort of in a recession. We're getting out of it. It's getting better. But we actually have unemployment rates increasing when there's a recession. Okay, so the shaded area basically shows periods when there was a recession. So there's unemployment rates high here. Shaded area unemployment rate was high. Shaded area unemployment rate was high. Shaded area unemployment rate was high. Again, another shaded area unemployment rate high. Unemployment rate high. Recession unemployment rate is always high. Okay, so unemployment rate tends to be high generally when there's a recession, and when there's an economic expansion, unemployment rate tends to be low. Okay, so there's an expansion and unemployment rate is low. Expansion, unemployment rate is low. Unemployment rate is low, and unemployment rate was relatively low before we actually had this recession. Okay, so that's the first indicator, and that tells us what percentage of the labor force is basically unemployed. And then we have the employment to population ratio, and the employment to population ratio is basically the percentage of the working age population who actually have jobs. Okay, so which part of the working age population actually have jobs, right? And how do we find that? Is basically the employment or the employed divided by the working age population times 100. Okay, right, so basically we're looking at the working age population. We're saying out of this working age population, how many of them actually have jobs? Right, so in July 2020, the employment was 142 million and the working age population was 260 million. Okay, so the employment to population ratio is basically 142 million divided by 260 million, all times 100. Right, and you should get 54.6%. Okay, so 54.6% of the working age population was basically employed. Okay, right, and then finally we have the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate basically looks at members of the working age population who are actually in the labor force. Okay, so which members of the working age population are able to actually work, right? Are able to actually work. Okay, so it's a percentage of the working age population who are members of the labor force. And the labor force participation rate is pretty simple to calculate. It's defined as the labor force divided by the working age population, all times 100. Okay, so in July 2020, the labor force was basically 160 million and the working age population was 260 million. Okay, so we can easily do that. So it's 160 divided by 260, all times 100. Okay, and what should we get? So the labor force participation rate was basically 61.53%. Okay, so now you've been able to learn how to calculate the unemployment rate, right? The employment to population ratio and the labor force participation rate. Okay, so let's just do a quick class activity. Okay, so you can pause the video here and see if you can actually sort of calculate the unemployment rate. Okay, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in Jazzland during September 2020, these were the following figures. The labor force was 160 million. The employed was 152 million. The working age population was 254 million. From this, you should be able to calculate the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, and the employment to population rate. Okay, so this is where we end this segment of the video. You've learned how to calculate the unemployment rate, labor force participation rate, and the employment to population rate. So next time we'll come back with the answers to that, and we'll look at other definitions of the unemployment rate as well. Okay. Thank you.